talk for a little bit.
All right. Well, thanks, Mike and Matt. That's we'll descend back into the historical past of when pollen was a whole lot more fun, because we only had one or two sites, and most of them had absolutely ridiculous dating, of which we couldn't really hone in on particular points, and it left the field very free to speculate. And in fact, one of the parts of Eric's work was to try and he had realized, along with many other people, that there was an abundance of pollen results out there, and most of them just sitting in people's folders or hopefully the counts actually retained somewhere. Some published, but usually only in highly summary forms, and that this was a big data bank that should be brought into the international arena. So really the theme of Simon and my talk is how we might move towards freeing up all this data. The motives for that in Eric's case were to try and get some comparable sites, but make it a tool for everybody in the field to use. And at the same time, there was this sort of what we might call a tertiary type of or quaternary or pentary interest in collating massive data sets without actually doing any of the work yourself. And that has also been an influence on getting data into particular forms. So I met Eric in 1992 at the IPC, the International Pollen Conference at must have been Aix-en-Provence. And then following that conference, Eric very kindly offered to give some of us he was about a 3 or 4 day workshop on Tilia. And as Matt McGlone has described it, Tilia in those days, and to some extent still, is he thought it proved that Eric was underneath his quiet, calm and kind exterior a terrific sadist. And it is true that it was extremely frustrating to use in its very early forms. But I have to remember that it was even more frustrating to do what we're doing. Professor Haberle there used up an entire year of his life using his Mac to devise how to draw his admittedly elegant pollen diagrams in 1990, must have been about 1992 or 1, to finish his PhD on the uplands of the Tari region. Long course, some of which I'm sure, as he knows, he will have to rush back to now and look at the 42,000 year levels, as indeed I do. So that workshop had about 10 or 12 participants, and we slowly worked our way through Tilia. And Eric had really sat down and thought about what it is that pollen analysts want to do with their data. In fact, much more than I ever had. I was really just keen to get a fairly simple pollen sum and whack into it and try and produce a percentage diagrams. But he had a lot more bells and whistles in there. And the problem was you had to recall thousands of little detailed keystrokes really to get some of them out. So it was a case of attending the workshop, achieving modest success with the data banks we'd brought along, and then putting poor Eric under the load of probably, I mean, I emailed him dozens of times, so I suppose if everybody else did from that and subsequent workshops, he's really been a kind of agony aunt for a whole generation of dumb palynologists. So the first thing you want to say about Eric is he's amazingly patient with dumb people, of which I am one. And he always had a higher feeling for it, but he was very happy to help us dull plodders. Subsequently, I developed, just basically from the fact that I'd been around since about the first or second pollen diagram ever got produced for the Australasian region, or the Australian region, I should say, since New Zealand was so several decades ahead of us. I'd produced a sort of a general database of sites that I'd heard of across the Indo-Pac And I kept tinkering with this and adding to it and following some of his suggestions. I slowly developed really what amounts to a annotated list, which I kept in a sortable program, one which in fact at the time we were trying to adapt to use for a proto-pollen atlas for the Southwest Pacific. And it's a program I hope none of you have ever heard of called FileMaker, which in those days only ran on Macs. But it can be used as a container for pollen, and it has excellent output characteristics, so you can print quite good materials from it. This in turn reflected the effort of the ANH to really, we faced up to the fact that we probably should be producing pollen atlases, and yet it was becoming apparent even by the 1970s that this was, if we did one, it would be instantly out of date and probably misleading, because when you've got let's say a general flora for the region of 50,000 things, and we'll take that as being at least 6,000 to 8,000 pollen types with a lot of options. The complexity and our lack of knowledge meant that we could produce maybe a book with 1,000 things in it, and it would never have the one you really wanted to see, and secondly, it would be misleading. It would say this pollen type equals this grain, and people would start calling it that. So clearly the slow evolution of computers, and this is where Eric was our pioneer, meant that we could look at getting both the databases and of the sites and site records and site data and chronology together. And also, of course, subsequently Simon took over the pollen atlas along with a few teams, and of us giving him free and probably unwelcome advice, and we moved to a mainframe application. And Simon will no doubt mention how he's making yet another leap forward, as it were, right now on getting that pollen base to go. But it certainly illustrates what I've just been saying. I mean, I've depended on it for when I've tackled new sites like, say, Kokoda in lowland New Guinea, and it's terrifically helpful for suggesting pollen types, but not always. You know for a fact that it's almost certainly whatever you're looking at is not what the pollen atlas is producing, and there's always a armload of unknowns. So Eric and I, because I'd done this little database, I ended up giving some very rudimentary talks to the subsequent IPCs, which were every 4 years, and for that reason I got shipped out to talk to Sandy Harrison and the Biome Project, and eventually Spitfire, but I think my period of usefulness rapidly evaporated because I never could, and this was the second thing I want to say about Eric, is he was amazingly patient. He obviously would have loved me to do the job that Annika and others have subsequently done of collecting all the actual records and actually coding them all in and actually solving the problem that we don't have a decent taxa list for more than, maybe we've got a reasonable one now for southeastern Australia and for Tasmania, but really, and maybe upland New Guinea, but not really so much for other parts. So that is still a work in progress, and it has to be dynamic. But the wonderful thing about the computing age is that you can produce a version and you haven't invested $20,000 finding a printer for it, and it can be modified and adapted. And the aim with the pollen atlas was always to be able to extract the sites of interest for your region, to extract the pollen data ideally. But at this stage we have something like 1,200 sites recorded in the IndoPact database, and we only really have corrected site data for maybe half of those. We know where some of the other data is, and I'm talking to you, Peter Kershaw, but actually moving it on into Neotoma is obviously the desirable moment now. And of course, I've got wonderful resolutions to at least get my own and associated data that nobody else can possibly get hold of into Neotoma, but I can't claim to have made huge progress on that either. So thanks very much, Simon, for scaring up a few resources for this. And I guess I just want to thank Eric for his patience and his encouragement and his lack of any kind of we are the greatest kind of attitude. Some of his early results, which he worked with other people on at NOAA, such as Showtime and Sites here, which were nice visual elements of a database, are still, I think, terrific applications. In some ways, I'm sorry they couldn't be upgraded, but I imagine Neotoma will do that job very well in the future. So I'll stop there and hand back to Simon.
Thanks, Geoff. And as usual, I think you're underselling yourself on that one. You've done an amazing job with Eric and other people in the community to bring together what we currently have. And this is just a quick summary of some of that information, really, about what is in the Indo-Pacific Polar Database, or what we hope to upload in the next 2 years or so, principally with Annika here, who'll be able to facilitate a lot of this work. She's put a lot of effort into refining that data, and with teams from abroad, we're going to be working on that. But essentially what we have at the moment, at least well over 280 pollen records from Australia, and in the broader Indo-Pacific database, there's 1,250. So you can imagine there's great power in that in terms of what can be done with analysing broad regions or global analysis, or even at a smaller scale. So it's exciting to be able to get to a stage where we can actually start to use this data. Currently, however, in Neotoma, there are 35 sites, and this is a rough estimation of or a diagram of where they are, and gives you a sense of the distribution of what's there currently. Obviously, this is far short of where we hope to be, but obviously, and we're putting in that effort over the next year or so. But Eric put in a lot of effort, as we all know, around the globe, but even in the Pacific region of Australia, he recently uploaded some sites from Fiji, which really wonderful sites Wendy Southern and Geoff Hope put together, making them available to everybody. And so, not just the Australian region, but out in the Pacific, really important to get these records out and available to people to see. What our task is over the next little while, Annika's had an amazing PhD in which she put together some 208 pollen records, went through them, and you were able to harmonise or synchronise some of those in terms of the data. And here's just some of those distributions. You see, it's a very Eastern Australian tropical kind of distribution, most in the southeast of Australia, in fact, and the climate pattern you see here highlights how the missing deserts, basically, of Australia still remain somewhat missing. So this is a task in the future to fill in those gaps. But we do have a remarkable data set that's there that just needs to be loaded into Neotoma, and gives you a sense of the kind of scale. We have sites, obviously, Michael Fletcher's site, Matt's going back many tens of thousands of years. Most of our sites, however, cluster, I guess, in that late glacial to Holocene period, and this is just a sort of gross summary of eucalyptus across all those sites, and you can see essentially the data showing the sort of smoothing of the record, and after about 14,700, which is in this part of the world, that beginning of that late glacial transition, and the accumulation of organic preservation, essentially, denoted by many more pollen records, which you see in this sort of summary. But as part of this, we were able to come together, as I mentioned, with Eric in late June of last year. There's a lot of people, some familiar faces to many of you, I'm sure, students as well in Australia. Jessica Blois will be talking later in this 24-hour session will be with Zia along with Eric and training the next generation essentially to try and build these databases. A really wonderful effort. And this is the big idea, I guess, in terms of, I don't want to go through this in detail, but it essentially outlines the rationale and the map we want to follow over the next 2 years to build with the help of what CABAR, the Centre of Excellence that's helping to fund some of this work in Australia, HOPE, the Humans on Planet Earth out of Norway, Bergen, John Burke's and company, Neotoma, of course, out of the US, have devoted some of their people to be able to help us build and upload this data set we have a hold of at the moment, around 208 sites. And this will enable us, I hope, to really answer some of the really interesting and big questions. And these are just 3 that I came up with. There are many more, of course, for the Sahul or the New Guinea Australian region. We can ask these big questions about human influence, 65,000 years ago arrival perhaps, but also this intriguing period around 41,000 years ago, the Chomp perhaps, or we see indications of megafaunal extinction there as well, which are highly debated, but denote rapid change. 12,000 years ago, perhaps human influence or late glacial transitions, 7K, development of agriculture in the highlands of New Guinea. What are the implications for the broader Sahel region? 4,000 years ago, increases in the rate of change denoted. We've got the science paper coming out soon looking at that issue, and even later change that can be recorded in Australia and across the Pacific as you get that colonisation invasion period in the last 200 or to 300 years out across the Pacific, and the massive changes that's brought in the region. So rates of change, things looking at tipping points, the resilience of flora, are really tools that are being made available in Neotoma. And this will, I think, in many ways bring together the community into great meta-analysis works that can start to emerge once we get this data up into the Neotoma format. And of course, another issue that I think is really important here and across the globe as well is how can we ensure that these paleoecological records play a positive role, particularly in communicating the significance of things like Indigenous land management practices that in some areas are over 60,000 years old. The use of fire, plant use and biodiversity maintenance. How significant are they in the current and future land management strategies? And I think paleoecology can play a really significant and important role in conveying that message in collaboration with these communities. And just finally, thanks for your attention in this Indo-Pacific session, or at least Australia and New Zealand, and just like to finish with saying Valet Eric. And I believe we go to a break now. So please do go to a break and return when the next session begins.
Yeah, 15 minutes later, so we will start the Asian part. Okay. So we have a short break. So and I will stop the recording at this time.